Hey everybody, it's Magic Prepper, and I wanted to let you know that not all AR-15 lower receivers are created equally. And I know that's a contentious thing to say, because generally when you're buying a stripped lower receiver, or even a complete lower receiver, people will tell you to get the cheapest one possible because, well, they're all forged at the same place anyway, so why would you pay any extra? And now, there is some truth to that concept, however, there are some other things that you should be considering before you just buy the cheapest possible receiver you can find in order to understand what it is you're paying more for if you want to step it up. So I do want to thank Midway USA for making videos like this possible, and of course they have everything you need when it comes to things related to, I don't know, lower receivers, so a big thanks to Midway USA. Now this got me thinking to make this video because I recently picked up a stripped lower receiver from Palmetto State Armory, and this one was about 50 bucks, right? And of course, people will say, hey, you can get those for like 30 sometimes, right? Well, this was at my local gun store. I like to support them, and I didn't have to pay a transfer fee. So 50 bucks, really not too bad. Now, why would you ever spend more than $50 if you can get this for that price, right? When this is a forged lower receiver and any other forged lower receiver is the same, right? That's what you're told anyway by a lot of people, especially on the internet, because they come from the same forge. But that doesn't really cover all the bases as to why you might spend more money on a different lower receiver from a different manufacturer. Now, before we jump into the exact details on that, I do want to say there are some things you should be aware of. First off, there are things called billet receivers, which is what I have right here. This is a Wilson Combat billet receiver. Now, billet is actually machined out of a solid aluminum block, and it allows the manufacturer to add some fancy looking parts and components or nice enhanced trigger guards, and it also gives the ability to add a little flair, but sometimes step outside of the realm of mil spec. And so that means not all parts might be compatible with your billet lower, and they also tend to be more expensive because the process costs more. So be aware of that. Now, what's good about billet lowers is that, well, they're machined to spec by the companies who sell them generally, and that means they can have tighter tolerances and have a lot more QC when it comes to what it is they're allowing for based on the way these are manufactured. That being said though, these aren't what people are saying are the same. They're going with forged lowers. And just in case you want to clear any confusion, this is an Aero Precision M4E1 lower. Now, Aero Precision, at least in my experience, makes pretty good lower receivers. In fact, most of the time, this M4E1 is my go-to when I'm trying to start a new build. The issue here is that this is actually a hybrid forged billet style lower. So it's a forged receiver. You still get the strength of a forged receiver because I know I didn't mention that before, but forged receivers tend to be stronger than billet. Not that that would probably matter to the average shooter out there, especially a civilian, but in general, forged receivers are stronger than billet ones. But this one gives you the strength of a forged receiver while also having some enhancements you would get from a billet receiver generally, like a built-in enhanced trigger guard. And there's some other fancy things here too, like a threaded bolt catch pin, so that way it's a lot easier to install. There's some things that I like about these lowers, and they run really well, and I haven't had any issues with their compatibility and mil-spec parts. But that being said, this is also in its own class, much like a billet, and this generally costs more than a forged lower will, and the billet is the most expensive type of forged lower that you can get. And of course, billet lowers can come in all types of varieties, mostly, I don't know, of the meme variety, right? The ones that have the helmet of a knight on the front, those are billet lowers, okay? So, what we're referring to here are forged lowers specifically, because there is truth to the concept that there's only so many forges, and they all forge the lowers for these manufacturers. And that's where PSA gets their lowers from, whatever forge they're using, and then they get it in-house, and that's where the price point starts to change. What does that mean? Well, for example, here is a BCM lower receiver. Now this is also a forged lower receiver, mil-spec to the same standards in the sense of what the forge puts out as the Palmetto State Armory one. You can see it even has all the same shapes and geometry and everything else. These are both forged mil-spec lower receivers, okay? Why would you spend twice as much, sometimes 3 times or even 4 times as much on a BCM lower receiver than a Palmetto State Armory lower receiver if they're from the same forge and they're both exactly the same and just as good, right? That's the saying that's going to keep coming around. Well, here's the thing. What you're paying for is what happens after the receiver leaves the forge. These companies receive these receivers, and then they start the process of quality control. Then they start the process of machining the receivers. Then they start the process of deciding how many actually hit their standards and how many have to be thrown away. And depending on a company's standards, receivers might not make it through a passing grade, whereas for other companies, they might. And that's where the costs come into play. So, with a BCM lower receiver like this one, you're getting a higher level of quality control. You're getting a more, let's just say, precise level of machining once the forged receiver is received by BCM, the manufacturer. And you also have a higher ratio of receivers not meeting their standards based on whatever measurements and anything else they're using for those standards that it doesn't comply with. Versus something like the PSA receiver, which honestly has a good chance of being just fine. There is a good chance that this receiver is going to be perfectly in spec and work no problem. But in order to get it in your hands for $50, right? Or sometimes like you see their sales, $30, like really cheap, right? And don't even mention Anderson. I mean, in the past, I've been able to find those for like 25 bucks. Crazy, right? Well, since they're from the same forge and they're made from the same materials, the only way they're actually saving enough money to sell you this for as cheap as they can sell it for is by skipping some of those quality control processes, is by having looser standards when it comes to what's acceptable from them to then sell to you. Having maybe less time spent on the machining and ensuring that everything is done to a level of quality, right? That's where the money gets saved. So you can easily get a Palmetto State Armory strip lower that's perfectly inspected, perfectly machined, and had excellent quality control. But you are gambling as to whether or not that's going to be the case at a higher ratio of the odds being against you. And that's really the difference. So they're not just as good necessarily, and they're not exactly the same. They are from the same materials and likely the same forge, or at least made in the exact same process, which produces a good product, a very strong lower receiver. But the manufacturer themselves are deciding how good of a lower it is they're willing to sell to you thereafter. And if you don't remember my video about my issues with my Ruger MPR AR-556, that lower receiver was out of spec. I was upset about it. I sent it in for warranty. They felt that it was fine. Not necessarily my opinion, but that's what they felt. So their standards were much lower than a company like BCM or LMT, Daniel Defense, any of these higher end companies. They work with tighter tolerances and tighter standards because that's what's expected from them. So, like I said, this is probably fine because you're just working with a ratio or a percentage where the odds are a little bit more against you by buying a very cheap lower receiver that there's something out of spec or something's just not quite exactly straight, right? Which is a lot of times the issue with trigger pin holes, is that the holes are drilled at a very slight angle that you can't see with the human eye, but your trigger pins will walk out, right? There's all types of little things like that that you won't be able to tell upon visual inspection that could be problematic with this receiver. And by buying a $50 receiver, I'm just gambling on the fact that I'm hoping the one I got is one of the good ones. And so I don't know these numbers for sure, but just to give you a perspective and something to think about. Let's say the chance of this receiver being good is 60%, right? Or at least perfectly in spec. Good is also subjective because one that's not, perfectly in spec might still work. So people would assume that's good, right? So let's just say one that's perfectly in spec, 60% chance. At $50, okay. But then when you go to a BCM lower, and you're talking about the percentage of the chance you're going to get one that's perfectly in spec, well, that might go up to 90%, right? So that might be worth the additional funds for you. Or you might be willing to take that risk in order to save money. But that doesn't mean these are the same. These manufacturers have different levels of machining and different levels of quality control, and that's what you're paying for when you spend more, not that you're paying for the exact same materials and the exact same forging process. That's the lie that people tell you because maybe they're not fully aware of where those price differences come from. But that's what it is. And I don't think there's anything wrong with buying inexpensive lower receivers, but you should be aware of what it is you're gambling when you do so. And you should be aware of the fact that there's a higher chance it might not be in spec, right? And there's still a chance this BCM lower might not be in spec because you still have that variance of maybe 10% over here of it not being in spec, but maybe over here it's 40%, right? Like I said, I don't know those numbers. I'm just using that as an example to give you a perspective about what it is I'm trying to convey. So hopefully that gives you some things to think about. And one thing I might mention that could be beneficial for you, especially when it comes to trying to save money on certain components, but then having versatility and access to different systems that might fill a role you need in your arsenal, let's just say. Well, one thing that a lot of people tend to forget with AR-15s, which I'm guilty as charged because for some reason, every lower receiver like this one eventually turns into a full-blown rifle, right? I can't help myself. It just happens. It's like magic. Well, if you wanted to do things more economically, I think it would be a good idea to spend the extra money on a high-quality lower receiver and then maybe just spend the other money on additional uppers instead of additional rifles, right? A lot of people kind of forget that we can just buy different upper receivers and slap them on the same lower receiver. So wouldn't it be nice to have a high-quality lower receiver that you know is in spec, has good quality control, good machining, and everything is good to go, that you can just put different uppers on to fulfill different roles. You've got your 10.3 for your CQB or whatever it is you think you're gonna do. You've got your 16-inch for your general purpose stuff. You've got your 18-inch SPR. All of them slap right on top of that really nice high quality lower that you don't have to worry about being a problem for you. So just something to consider. I wanted to share this with everybody because, like I said, I'm not afraid to build this lower receiver into a rifle. Like, I think it'll be fine. But I know there's a higher chance that it might not be compared to something else. So I'm prepared to deal with that if that time comes. But not everybody is, and not everybody is aware of any of the things I just told you. All they're going off of is the fact that somebody told them they're all forged at the same place, so why would you spend more money? And now, hopefully, you know why you would spend more money. Okay? Now, I do want to thank LMT. I actually got them on the phone, talked to them about some of this process and how it is that their lowers are so much more expensive than something like a PSA, and they gave me a lot of good information regarding that, and that's how I developed this opinion. So it's not just me saying this because I want to say it. I'm trying my best to give you good information that's based on real facts that exist out there in the ether. And hopefully this gives people considerations to make. If this is your budget, well, be prepared for what may come because of this being your budget. That doesn't mean it's a bad idea. It just means that you should be aware of the fact that it could be a little wonkier than something else maybe. I don't know. I haven't built it yet. But if this is in your budget and then you can build additional lower or uppers for it later, well, maybe that's the right way to go. Let me know in the comments below what your thoughts are on this. Look, I know everyone loves their PSA. I get it. And look, like I said, I don't have a problem with this. I don't think it's going to be a problem. But I just didn't want everyone out there to just believe that things are just as good just because someone said so, right? Being fully informed means that you are probably going to be more financially savvy when you make your investments. And I hope that helps you. So, anything else you need from me at all, go to magicprepper.com. And besides that, that's going to be it for Magic Prepper.